And hello Stowe community, welcome to part 7 of our Back to Basics tutorial series. In this tutorial I'm going to talk about branching and the various tricks that you can do to add branching in your mission using triggers and pop-up dialogues. Really dialogue bubbles that you place directly on a map. And so far, as you've learned the Foundry, you've probably thought of it as a pretty linear tool, as a tool to tell a rather linear story. After all, there's the storyboard, and it's one task followed by another, followed by another. You can sometimes add variety. For example, you can drop one thing on top of another to create a complete all objective, and that means when the player gets to this spot in your mission, they'll have to do everything you put in a complete all box, but they can do it in any order that they want to do it in. So that does add some variety, but at the same time, they have to do everything. So there's not really any branching involved other than decide which direction you want to go and then come back and run the other direction. However, there are some things that you can do with triggers to add branching choices. And let's go to our ground map on Vulcan. Our Vulcan diplomat's still there. I think she's also in the storyboard. Let's take her out of the storyboard. Okay, we'll go back to the Vulcan ground map. And if we click on her, she has this option, has default text. And if we go into the advanced dialogue editor, we can create a much more elaborate default dialogue for her. Oh, come on, work with. We can create a much more elaborate default dialogue with her that could involve different choices or different options, and each of her buttons here has triggers. So for example, if on the map there were different consoles that a player could interact with, and say these consoles weren't in the storyboard, but they're just set on a map and maybe they're set to disappear using this component complete. Now they don't have to disappear because you could put a second console set to appear when the first console disappears. So from the player's perspective, they're just interacting with the console. And you can do that in many different areas of the map. Now, with our Vulcan diplomat, depending upon what the character does, say he goes and scans one console, returns to the Vulcan diplomat, she could say something totally different, or have what you can think of as the cryptic green button response, right when there's an NPC and they say, "How is your day? Have you solved the mystery?" And then there's nothing else that they say. But if you discover a clue and you come back to that NPC, then there's this green text, this additional option to say, "I have found a clue," or maybe it's an additional question you could ask the NPC. And so there's a lot that you can do with that just in the map tab here. But another thing that we can do is let's go back to the storyboard. We'll put talk to contact, dialogue with contact in there. We'll specify the text. Let's talk to diplomat. And we'll select the diplomat. Stowe's servers are over capacity right now, so this is why the Foundry is so sluggish. And it doesn't really matter what she says for this tutorial. Now, in the storyboard, the task is to talk to her. And then after we talk to her, let's say we want to reach a marker, and let's pretend that we've put a marker, somewhere over here, or somewhere up here. So the task for the player to do is talk to the Vulcan diplomat and then go reach a marker. Well, depending on what the diplomat says, and depending upon the triggers, you could have a lot of stuff happen in between talking to the diplomat and reaching the marker. So for example, if we go to details and we search for invisible objects, you could put 2 invisible objects at the same spot. Let's call the first one choice A, and then we'll put a second one in called choice B. Choice A will set it to appear when an objective is complete, and that objective will be talk to the Vulcan diplomat. Same thing with choice B. It will become visible when an objective is complete, and that objective is talk to the diplomat. Now here's where the tricky part comes in. I want one to be a choice. I want one of the choices to disappear when the other choice is made, so that the choice doesn't just hang around. So with choice A, we'll want it to be invisible, go invisible when a component is complete, and that component will be choice B. I hope that makes sense. And then choice A, or choice B, will become invisible if choice A is made. Oh, the Foundry is so sluggish. Alright, so now what happens is, depending upon the choice that the player makes, all kinds of other stuff could happen. So let's say the choice A is picked. Well, that could be followed by a group of enemies that beam in the map, and they're set to appear when that component is complete, when the choice A component is complete. Or if the choice B component is complete, something else could happen. Say, a character could have a different dialogue appear with the dialogue bubbles that you place directly on a map. These guys. Okay, this is not going to respond very well. I'm just going to explain it. So the dialogue bubbles, they can be set to appear with component completes, and you can see kind of what you could do with this, where you can create a string of different branches depending on the components that are completed and the choices that a player makes. You could also send a player different directions around a map. For instance, if it's do you want to go right or do you want to go left, and then all the different triggers can happen on different parts of the map. So the player doesn't always have to go to the same spot. Now eventually, despite what you do with all these triggers and components, the player still has to reach that marker, regardless of what choice they make. So that's something to keep in mind. That really is the biggest limitation of branching, is that you're still stuck in the end with a storyboard where the task has to be complete regardless of what choice the player makes. Something also to consider when you do play around with this is it can be very confusing for players, because players are trained to play Star Trek Online in a certain way, and they watch for that go here, do A, scan something else. And when you do this with triggers, you have to kind of disguise it in the story tab, because you don't want the player to see the task of go reach the marker immediately. You want to disguise the task as keep exploring or look for clues. And so when it comes to the point where the player needs to find that reach marker that is tied to that task in the storyboard, you really have to rely on other things like an NPC to say, hey, you go there. So keep that in mind. I mean, there's some really creative things that authors can do with triggers and branching dialogue and pop-up bubbles that you add to the map. But please keep the player in mind also, because it can confuse them when there are too many optional objectives without clear enough instructions on where to go. Okay, I hope that helps. Sorry that the performance of Foundry isn't really good today, but I hope that's useful to you. Okay, thanks.